Blood froze to Thomas Halloway's cheek before he even realized he was bleeding. Plunging into a remote forest ravine at 60 miles an hour was only his first mistake. What happened next in those isolated Bitterroot woods would push a dying man to attempt a deeply insane, utterly brilliant survival method. Snow didn't just fall, it weaponized. What began as a routine drive through the Bitterroot Pass on a late Tuesday afternoon quickly devolved into a meteorological nightmare. Thomas Halloway, a 42-year-old structural engineer from Missoula, gripped the leather steering wheel of his Ford F-150 until his knuckles turned the color of chalk. He was supposed to be checking on an off-grid property owned by his father-in-law, Arthur Pendleton, near the Lolo National Forest. Arthur had called that morning, frantic about a collapsed roof on his generator shed. Thomas had promised his wife, Sarah, he'd be back before dinner. He wouldn't make it to dinner. Local meteorologist Gary Klein's voice crackled through the static on the AM radio, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tightly wound urgency. Upgrading this system to a bomb cyclone. We are looking at unprecedented barometric pressure drops. Temperatures will plummet to -30 by nightfall, with wind chills exceeding -50. If you are on the roads, find shelter immediately. Do not. Static swallowed the warning. The truck's headlights cut through a swirling vortex of white, illuminating absolutely nothing. Visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. Thomas tapped his brakes, intending to pull over and wait it out, but the mountain road had already vanished beneath a slick, invisible sheet of black ice, disguised by a thin layer of powder. Traction abruptly ceased to exist. Gravity took over. The heavy truck spun the rear end, kicking out toward the guardrail. Thomas cranked the wheel into the skid, a desperate maneuver born of decades driving Montana roads. But the momentum was too fierce. Metal shrieked as the truck pulverized the rusted steel barrier. For one terrifying, weightless second, the Ford was suspended in the freezing air. Then came the violent, bone-shattering descent. The vehicle violently rolled down a 70-degree embankment, smashing through decades-old pine trees that tore off the truck's doors and shattered every window. Airbags deployed with the concussive force of a shotgun blast, filling the cabin with a bitter chemical smoke. Thomas's head slammed against the driver's side window frame as the truck came to a brutal, grinding halt at the bottom of the ravine, buried deep in a snowdrift. Silence descended heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of the dying radiator. Consciousness returned in jagged, agonizing flashes. Thomas blinked his vision, swimming with dark spots. A warm, sticky liquid dripped into his left eye. He raised a trembling hand to his forehead, pulling away fingers coated in crimson. But the blood was the least of his problems. When he tried to shift his weight, a blinding, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder. Dislocated. His right ankle throbbed with a sickly swelling pressure trapped beneath the crumpled dashboard. Panic, primal and cold, clawed at his throat. He forced himself to breathe. Think, Thomas. Think. He braced his good leg against the seat and pushed, screaming through gritted teeth as he wrenched his trapped ankle free. The pain was nauseating, but the joint wasn't broken, just severely sprained. He unbuckled his seatbelt and practically fell out of the shattered windshield, collapsing into waist-deep snow. Instantly, the brutal reality of the storm hit him. The wind howled like a wounded animal, slicing through his heavy canvas jacket like it was made of tissue paper. The temperature was dropping by the minute. If he stayed by the wreckage, he would freeze to death in less than an hour. He dragged himself to the truck bed, desperately searching for his emergency kit. Gone. Tossed somewhere in the quarter-mile stretch of wreckage above him. All he had were the items in his pockets: a bright orange butane lighter, a folding hunting knife, a half-empty plastic water bottle that was already beginning to freeze, and a small coil of paracord. Survival odds plummeted. He looked up at the steep, jagged path the truck had carved into the mountain. Climbing back up to the road with a dislocated shoulder and a ruined ankle was physically impossible in a blizzard. Desperation forced his mind to race. He remembered Arthur showing him a topographical map of this area years ago. There was an old, abandoned trapping cabin built by a local eccentric named Cletus McGraw back in the late 70s. It was situated somewhere along the creek bed, roughly a mile east of this ridge. It was a long shot, a needle in a frozen haystack, but it was his only chance. Thomas tucked his injured left arm inside his jacket, using the heavy fabric as a makeshift sling, and began to walk. Every step was a negotiation with agony. The snow was a thick, dragging weight against his thighs. The wind relentlessly pushed him backward, while the ice-crystal snow sandblasted his exposed face. Minutes stretched into hours. Shadows lengthened as the pale winter sun surrendered to the storm, plunging the forest into a deep, disorienting grey. Hypothermia began its insidious invasion. His shivering became violent, uncontrollable spasms. His fingers and toes transitioned from burning pain to a terrifying, absolute numbness. Just as his knees buckled, sending him pitching face forward into the snow, a darker silhouette emerged from the swirling whiteout. Square, unnatural angles. It was McGraw's cabin. Salvation was a rotting wooden husk. Thomas dragged his battered body up the 3 collapsing steps to the small porch. The heavy oak door hung crookedly on a single rusted hinge, groaning under the force of the wind. Pushing his way inside, his heart sank. The cabin offered shelter from the wind, but absolutely nothing else. It was roughly 10 by 12 feet. 2 of the 4 small windows were completely shattered, allowing massive snowdrifts to accumulate across the rotting floorboards. In the corner sat a rusted cast-iron pot-belly stove, its chimney pipe jutting into the ceiling. Thomas collapsed onto the floor, his breath puffing into the air like thick smoke. He was shivering so violently that his teeth audibly clattered. He needed a fire, and he needed it 5 minutes ago. Before he could build one, he had to address the blinding pain in his shoulder. He couldn't maneuver firewood with a dead, hanging limb. He shuffled over to a sturdy vertical support beam in the center of the room. Bracing his wrist against the wood, he took a deep, shuddering breath, closed his eyes, and violently twisted his torso. A sickening pop echoed in the small room. Thomas roared, falling to his knees, as a wave of nausea washed over him. Blackness edged his vision. But as the acute agony subsided into a dull, manageable throb, he realized the joint was back in place. Time was running out. The temperature inside the cabin was identical to the temperature outside. It was easily negative 20 degrees, and the storm was still intensifying. Thomas crawled to the rusted stove. He used his hunting knife to pry open the heavy iron door. Inside was a layer of damp, ancient ash. He frantically scavenged the cabin for fuel. He tore dry splinters from the underside of a broken table, ripped pages from a waterlogged, decades-old almanac he found on a shelf, and gathered handfuls of dry pine needles that had blown in through the broken windows. His hands were practically useless. Frostbite was setting in. His fingers were pale, waxy, and rigid. It took him 4 agonizing attempts to strike the butane lighter. Finally, a small blue flame flickered to life. He held it to the paper. It caught. The pine needles flared, catching the small splinters of wood. Thomas fed the tiny blaze with larger chunks of the broken table, nursing it with gentle breaths. The fire crackled, growing stronger, casting a warm orange glow across his frozen face. Hope, fragile and fleeting, bloomed in his chest. Then the smoke began to back up. At first it was just a wisp escaping from the seams of the stovepipe, but within seconds, thick, acrid black smoke began violently billowing out of the open stove door, directly into Thomas's face. He coughed, falling backward. He looked up. The rusted stovepipe leading to the ceiling was completely severed, just below the roofline clogged solid, with decades of bird nests, ice, and compressed pine needles. The exhaust had nowhere to go but back into the room. Within 2 minutes, the small cabin was entirely filled with blinding, choking smoke. Thomas dropped to the floor, pressing his face against the snow-covered floorboards to find breathable air. His lungs burned. His eyes streamed with tears. The carbon monoxide was building rapidly. He could already feel the lethargic, dizzying weight of it pressing down on his brain. He had a horrifying choice to make: die of asphyxiation in a warm room, or put out the fire and freeze to death in the dark. Gasping for air, Thomas scooped up handfuls of snow from the floor and hurled them into the stove. The fire hissed violently, spitting a cloud of hot steam into the air before dying completely. Total darkness consumed the cabin. The silence that followed was deafening, amplified only by the howling wind tearing through the broken windows. Thomas sat in the dark, shivering violently, his wet clothes now clinging to him like a sheet of ice. The brief warmth of the fire had only made the returning cold feel infinitely worse. Despair hit him like a physical blow. He thought of Sarah. He thought of her sitting by the fireplace in their Missoula home, holding her phone, waiting for a text that would never come. He thought of the rescue crews that wouldn't even begin looking for him until the storm broke, which could be days. Hypothermia entered its secondary stage. The violent shivering began to slow down, a terrifying medical sign that his body was running out of the energy required to generate heat. His brain grew sluggish. The umbles took hold, he mumbled to himself, fumbled with his useless lighter, stumbled as he tried to stand. He needed body heat. He needed insulation. He stumbled to the corner of the room where an old rusted metal bed frame sat. The mattress had been shredded by animals years ago, leaving nothing but a thin, filthy canvas cot stretched across the springs. It offered zero insulation from the freezing air circulating beneath it. Sitting on the edge of the cot, his hazy mind drifted to a documentary he had watched with Arthur years ago about indigenous survival techniques in the Arctic. He remembered a specific detail about the Siberian Chukchi people and how they survived nights out on the tundra without modern sleeping bags. They didn't build large fires to warm the air. They couldn't. Instead, they warmed the earth and let the earth warm them. Thomas blinked, his lethargic brain struggling to process the thought. He looked down at the dirt floor beneath the metal bed frame. It was frozen solid, mixed with gravel and pine needles. He looked back at the stove, where the damp ashes were still radiating a faint residual heat. If he couldn't use the stove because of the smoke? What if he didn't need the stove at all? What if he only needed the coals? A spark of desperate, insane clarity pierced through his freezing mind. It was a massive risk. If he fell asleep with burning embers underneath him, he could easily incinerate himself or succumb to carbon monoxide if the ventilation wasn't right. But doing nothing guaranteed. He would be a frozen corpse by sunrise. Thomas gripped his hunting knife, dropped to his bruised knees, and began violently hacking at the frozen dirt floor directly beneath the bed. Frigid dirt tore at his fingernails, the frozen ground offering fierce resistance against the serrated edge of his hunting knife. Thomas Halloway possessed almost no strength left yet. The primal, desperate urge to live hijacked his exhausted muscles. He hacked at the floorboard gap directly underneath the rusted metal cot, prioritizing the loose, sandy soil that had accumulated over 40 years. Each strike of the blade sent a jarring shockwave up his forearm, aggravating his freshly relocated shoulder, but he ignored the white-hot flashes of pain. Hypothermia was dragging his consciousness into a dark, seductive abyss. He knew if he stopped moving, he would simply fall asleep and never wake up. Bit by bit, he excavated a shallow trench beneath the bed frame. It was only about 6 inches deep, roughly 2 feet wide, and 4 feet long, just large enough to mirror the dimensions of his torso. The ground was littered with small, smooth river stones, brought in by decades of flooding, which he meticulously lined along the bottom of the makeshift pit. His engineering background flickered to life in his fading mind. Stones would absorb and radiate heat far more efficiently than loose soil, acting as a thermal battery throughout the long, brutal night. Next came the terrifying part, making the fire. He could not use the potbelly stove, as the severed chimney had already proven lethal. But he could not build a blazing bonfire inside the cabin either, because the smoke would still pool under the low ceiling and suffocate him. He needed an intense, fast-burning fire right by the shattered window, utilizing the raging storm's wind to suck the toxic smoke outside. Crawling painfully to the doorframe, he gathered the remaining dry wood he had scavenged from the destroyed table. He arranged the splinters into a tight, teepee-shaped structure just inches from the broken window. The gale-force winds howled through the opening, threatening to scatter his tinder. He used his own body as a shield, curling around the wood stack to block the direct gusts. His waxy, frost-bitten fingers fumbled with the butane lighter. It took 10 agonizing tries. On the 11th, a tiny spark caught a fragment of dried moss. He fed it carefully, nursing the fragile flame until it consumed the larger chunks of wood. The fire roared to life, aggressively fueled by the massive intake of oxygen from the storm. As expected, the brutal draft from the window acted like a vacuum, pulling the majority of the black smoke out into the blizzard, though enough lingered in the cabin to make his eyes sting and his lungs burn. He coughed violently, tasting copper and ash. For 30 minutes, Thomas fed every scrap of combustible material he could find into the blaze. He tossed in broken chair legs, torn pages from the almanac, and even peeled off his own heavy leather belt, tossing it into the flames to generate denser coals. He needed a thick, glowing bed of embers, not just a flashy fire. The heat radiating against his face was intoxicating, tempting him to just curl up next to it, but he knew the fuel would run out in an hour. An open fire would not sustain him until dawn. When the flames finally died down, leaving a robust, pulsing pile of orange and crimson embers, the real race began. Using a flat piece of rusted tin, he pried off a collapsed shelf. Thomas scooped the glowing coals and frantically transported them across the room to the trench he had dug beneath the cot. He spread them out evenly, making sure they covered the river stones. The ambient temperature in the room was plunging back down to 30 below zero, and his wet clothes were beginning to freeze stiff once again. Once the glowing embers filled the pit, the most crucial step remained. An open pit of coals under a canvas cot would catch the fabric on fire, or at the very least poison him with carbon monoxide as the embers slowly burned out. He needed to bury them. He scooped the loose, dry soil he had excavated earlier and began layering it over the burning coals. He packed roughly 3 inches of dirt directly on top of the glowing embers, burying them completely. The cabin plunged back into pitch blackness. Panic seized his chest. Without the glow of the fire, the oppressive, freezing dark felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. However, within 5 minutes, a miracle occurred. Placing a bare hand on the dirt floor beneath the cot, Thomas felt a profound, penetrating warmth. The earth itself was heating up. The rocks beneath the coals were absorbing the extreme temperature and slowly radiating it upward through the layer of soil. The dirt acted as a thermal regulator, preventing the bed from catching fire while trapping the carbon monoxide underground, slowly filtering it through the porous earth. Thomas painfully hauled himself onto the shredded canvas cot. The moment his back hit the thin fabric, the radiant heat from the buried coals transferred directly into his spine. It was not the scorching, dangerous heat of an open flame, but a steady, deep, ambient warmth that seeped into his frozen muscles. It felt like lying on a massive heating pad. The Chukchi survival technique was working. He pulled his freezing legs up to his chest, wrapping his good arm around his knees to maximize body heat retention. The wind screamed outside, tearing shingles off the roof and slamming against the rotting wooden walls, but a pocket of life-saving warmth enveloped the space between the dirt floor and his body. The night became a hallucinatory marathon of endurance. The pain in his injured ankle and shoulder throbbed in time with his racing heartbeat. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind conjuring vivid, feverish dreams of his wife Sarah, calling his name from the kitchen of their home, the smell of roasted coffee mocking his parched throat. Every time he jolted awake, terrified that the fire had died, he would press his hand to the dirt floor, finding it still wonderfully, impossibly warm. The earth held the heat, fighting back the lethal chill of the bomb cyclone. He lay there in the dark, a lone man suspended above a buried fire, waiting for a dawn he wasn't entirely sure would ever come. Sunlight felt like shattered glass against his eyelids. Thomas groaned a dry, rattling sound, escaping his cracked lips. He forced his eyes open, immediately squinting against the blinding crystalline glare flooding through the broken windows. The wind, which had roared like a jet engine for 14 hours, was gone. In its place was a heavy, absolute silence that felt almost sacred. He tried to sit up, and a symphony of agony erupted across his body. His left shoulder was a rigid, inflamed block of torment. His right ankle had swelled to the size of a grapefruit, pressing painfully against the leather of his boot. But as he pushed himself up from the canvas cot, a realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was alive. He looked down at the dirt floor beneath the bed. The soil was completely cold now, the buried coals having spent their last ounces of thermal energy hours ago. They had lasted just long enough to bridge the gap between life and death. The cabin was a meat locker, easily -10 degrees, but his core body temperature had remained stable enough to survive the night. Thirst ripped at his throat, sharp and demanding. He scooped a handful of snow from the floorboards, letting it melt on his tongue. It tasted of ash and dirt, but it was the best thing he had ever consumed. He ate handful after handful, hydrating his exhausted system, preparing for the ordeal ahead. Staying in the cabin was no longer an option. No one knew he was here. And the abandoned structure was completely hidden from the main highway. If he wanted to see his wife again, he had to get back to the road. Thomas fashioned a crude splint for his ankle, using a broken chair leg and the coil of paracord from his pocket, wrapping it tightly over his boot to immobilize the joint. He ripped a strip of canvas from the cot to reinforce the makeshift sling for his shoulder. Every movement was a monumental effort, draining his dangerously low energy reserves. Stepping out onto the cabin porch, the sheer scale of the storm's aftermath was staggering. The bitterroot forest was buried under 4 feet of fresh, powdery snow. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the pine trees sagging under the immense weight of the drifts. He began to march. It wasn't walking. It was a grueling, full-body plunge. With every step, he sank up to his waist in the powder. He used a long, sturdy branch as a walking stick, testing the depth of the snow and relying on it to pull his injured leg forward. 10 steps felt like a marathon. After 100 yards, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Hours bled together. The sun traced a low, brilliant arc across the pale blue winter sky, offering glaring light, but absolutely no warmth. Thomas was focused entirely on the topography, using the slope of the ravine to guide him back toward the direction of the highway. His mind began to fragment again. He started talking out loud, having full conversations with his father-in-law Arthur, arguing about the structural integrity of the shed roof. He was slipping back into the dangerous territory of severe hypothermia and exhaustion. By early afternoon, his body hit a wall. He collapsed face first into a massive snowdrift, the snow packing into his collar and freezing against his neck. He didn't have the strength to push himself back up. The pain was gone, replaced by a terrifying, peaceful numbness. This is where it ends, he thought. He had survived the night just to die in the morning sun. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the overwhelming urge to sleep. A low, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the snow beneath his ear. At first, he thought it was an avalanche, a final cruelty of the mountain. But the vibration was steady, mechanical. He forced his eyes open, lifting his head with agonizing slowness. Less than 50 yards away, the tree line broke, revealing the elevated curve of the highway. Flashing yellow lights cut through the bright afternoon glare. It was a massive, heavy-duty snowplow, its steel blade throwing giant arcs of white powder off the shoulder of the road. "Hey!" Thomas screamed or tried to. It came out as a weak, pathetic croak. He scrambled, clawing at the snow with his one good arm, dragging his dead leg behind him. He looked like a wounded animal desperately crawling toward the light. The plow was moving, slowly clearing the heavy drifts from the night before, but the driver was seated high up in the cab, focused entirely on the asphalt. Thomas reached the steep embankment leading up to the road. It was a 10-foot wall of plowed snow. He tried to climb, but the powder crumbled beneath his weight, sending him sliding right back down. The plow was passing him. In 10 seconds it would be gone, and another vehicle might not come for days. Desperation sparked a final surge of adrenaline. He remembered his bright orange butane lighter. He unzipped his jacket, reaching into his pocket with trembling, uncooperative fingers. He pulled the lighter out and raised it high above his head, frantically waving his arm back and forth against the stark white backdrop of the snowbank. Inside the cab of the Plough, Montana Department of Transportation, driver David Higgins caught a flash of unnatural neon orange in his right side mirror. It didn't belong in the landscape. Higgins hit the air brakes, the massive truck hissing to a halt, the yellow lights spinning in the frozen air. Higgins climbed down from the cab, sinking to his knees in the snow as he peered over the edge of the embankment. There, half buried in the drift, was a man covered in dried blood, gripping an orange lighter like it was a holy relic. "Hold on!" Higgins shouted, his voice echoing off the trees. "I'm coming down! I've got you!" When Higgins finally reached him, grabbing him by the back of his jacket to haul him out of the snow, Thomas Halloway dropped the lighter. He looked up at the stranger, a weak, bloody smile cracking his frozen face. "Took you long enough," he whispered, before the world finally faded entirely into black. 3 days later, Thomas woke up in the intensive care unit at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula. Sarah was asleep in the chair next to his bed, her hand tightly gripping his bandaged fingers. The doctors called his survival a medical anomaly. They told him that exposed to those specific temperatures with his level of injury, a human being should have frozen to death within 3 hours. When Thomas explained his improvised coal bed, the head trauma surgeon simply stared at him in disbelief, noting that it was a stroke of absolute raw genius that kept his core temperature just above the fatal threshold. Thomas never went back to that stretch of the Bitterroot Pass. He didn't need to. He carried the cold of that night in his bones for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the fragile, terrifying line between life and death. But more importantly, he carried the knowledge that when stripped of all modern comforts, when pushed to the absolute breaking point of human endurance, the instinct to survive is a fire that burns hotter than any winter storm. Survival is often a brutal test of human will against the unforgiving forces of nature. Thomas Halloway's incredible true story proves that ingenuity can spark life, even in the darkest, coldest moments. If this harrowing tale of resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more epic survival stories. We post new content weekly. Stay safe out there, and thanks for watching.